Hey everyone, and welcome to Digital Discourse ZA. Today's episode is a little bit different. We reached out to the hosts of the Square Brackets podcast, Jacques Rousseau and Greg Andrews, and asked if they'd be interested in a crossover episode. Greg and Jacques recently did a 4-part series on free speech, and you can find links to the audio of those conversations in the video description. What we are bringing you now is part 4 of that series. Even though this is the final installment, you don't have to listen to parts 1 to 3 first to enjoy this one. Mind you, you won't regret going back to check them out at some point. Anyway, without further ado, I'll give you the guys from Square Brackets, Greg Andrews and Jacques Rousseau.
So what are we talking about today?
Well, today we're going to wrap up for the moment our conversation on free speech, because there are always going to be more examples of that, and of its implications and violations and so forth to talk about in the future, but we want to move on to other topics too. So we're going to wrap it up for now and summarize some of the things we've said, and apologies if we end up repeating a few things, because it now has been 4 weeks in a row that we've been addressing this thing in general. But things we've covered so far, I mean, what would you say is in a sense a big take-home thing that we want to have listeners focus on?
I think the main message is around personal responsibility, that the debate around free speech is not something we can use as a bat to beat one another up in public discourse, but it is a call to action for those who regard these values as personally important. And we cannot absolve personal responsibility and look to state actors or agencies to protect free speech. These principles are enlivened by our participation.
No, I'd endorse that wholeheartedly, and add a second thing, which is besides encouraging people to take responsibility and not rely on the law and the courts, although they can, of course, and should do that too, we're also trying to say that there is an instrumental value in free speech, a pragmatic value in free speech, that we don't sympathize or subscribe to the perspective that it is an absolute good in itself. We think it serves a purpose, and therefore we are open to possibilities of that purpose being served by sometimes limiting speech.
Right.
So I think that's perhaps the summary of the two most important things. I'm going to kick off with an example of the difficult tension between respecting free speech and accepting that it can have bad consequences, and the difficulty of sometimes having to inhibit it for the sake of that greater good, perhaps. And I mean, you weren't involved, so you can tell me if we did it right. I mean, I don't think we did it right, so I was kind of answering my own question. But I mean, you might recall in 2016, I was at the University of Cape Town, or on the University of Cape Town's Academic Freedom Committee, and we had invited Flemming Rose, who published those Danish cartoons in the Jyllands-Posten. He was the cultural editor at the time, and he published images that eventually caused, or eventually were part of the causal chain that led to lots of riots and discontent, and depending on how you measure these things, and causality, perhaps even some fatalities. And
the images were deemed as offensive to Muslim readers.
Yeah, because many Muslims hold the view that it is impermissible to have depictions of the Prophet, and these were depictions of the Prophet which was solicited for an issue of the magazine that asked for what we cannot show. It asked for responses to the question of taboo and representation of Muhammad. And we invited him because, at least to the committee's mind, there were lots of misrepresentations about the situation, that it served a valuable free speech function, and that religious sensibilities, in a sense, weren't enough to trump that. And we also thought he'd been misrepresented in the sense that I don't think a fair reading justifies any claims of Islamophobia or something like that. But now remember the context, and of course that merits far more discussion than we're giving it now. I mean, those nuances. But remember the context. We're dealing with a situation in which the universities were, in some parts of the country, on fire, but they were all tense, and people were very riled up. And so bringing a person into that situation ran the risk of massively inflaming tensions. So in the end, I was on TV and the radio trying to defend this thing. And to cut the long story short, in the end, we were asked to rescind the invitation. We refused to do so, and then we were instructed by the university executive, or the university executive in a sense, decided to uninvite him on our behalf. Right. So that's the kind of no platforming discussion.
You were overruled.
Yeah, that's precisely.
So the initial request was from the university. When you said no, they just said, well, tough, we're not going to.
Precisely. Now my bind here, and I've written a few pieces on this. If you go to synapses.co.za, my website, you can read a bit about what I said at the time. And the concern is, or the issue is, I think it's the wrong decision because of the kind of heckler's veto thing. You don't want the people who are the most angry to dictate speech.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I care about my campus.
Yeah.
And if there is a real risk
Yeah.
of violence or injuries or something like that, and therefore, if we have to spend hundreds of thousands of rands on security, I start thinking, I don't like violations of free speech, but I also don't like money to be spent. And I mean, I'm going to say the word wasted, and people are going to hate me for saying that. They say, well, it's not wasted if it defends free speech.
Right.
But that's part of my point about the balancing of interests. So there, I thought it would be sufficient to say, for the executive to say, we're uninviting, and we regret having done so, or having to do so,
Right.
because we think it's wrong.
Right.
And we blame you for threatening us. We blame the hecklers.
The hecklers. Yes.
So you can make both points
Yeah.
at the same time. Instead, we got a statement which was capitulating,
Right.
in a sense.
So they actually didn't make that point.
No.
They simply said, on what grounds?
There was a largely unpersuasive defense of how this was a violation, perhaps a violation of some constitutional kind of imperatives that to perhaps contribute to this kind of dissent and discord at the university.
Gosh.
And it was very tenuous, the argument, and people can go read that in UCT's archives if you like, and I might have linked to it as well. So it didn't, in a sense, grapple with the nexus problem, where here we would have wanted to highlight the fact that free speech was being dealt a blow.
Yes.
And we understand that despite that, we're going to have to capitulate through no intention or desire of our own.
Right. And was there a real danger of violence breaking out? Was that clearly some level of intelligence received?
I was told that there was, but I've got no way of verifying this.
Yeah.
The problem is, as you'd know from your background in the religious communities, the Cape Muslim community is, by and large, I mean, forgetting the Pachad years and things like that, by and large, there's very little of that mistrust and antagonism that these issues raise in the rest of the world. So, again, understandably, one might have wanted to not threaten that I mean, it's not even fragile, but that harmony or understanding that currently exists.
Right. Yeah. And so your feeling is that you regretted the university's decision to disinvite Flemming Rose.
Yet I understood it.
Yeah. And was there any opportunity for the university to maybe couch that better? Did they even offer the opportunity for you and the others on the committee to give an alternative way around it? Or did they simply shut it down?
No, I mean, we were, various options were discussed, like a video feed in or something like that. All of these things felt to us insulting in a sense. So you either take that brave and perhaps bad step of disinviting, or you take the other step of pushing through with the whole thing. And of course the problem here is that politically hands were bound in that you don't want to do what I said one should do, which is blame the hecklers, because students were very sensitized to being blamed for things, right? So the response there would have been, oh, are you calling us violent?
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's a mess, and I'm trying to get listeners to understand that these decisions are complicated.
Yeah. And also, perhaps it's also worth putting in context, does what happened with Flemming Rose speak to a pattern of behavior on the part of UCT, for instance, and perhaps even other institutions in the country, where these decisions keep on taking place and amount to a pattern of essentially self-censorship, instead, or was it an isolated instance one can simply let go and say, well, you win some, you lose some?
Unfortunately, I think that it's the former, in the sense that this is becoming quite normalized.
Yeah.
This idea that if I don't like somebody, I can shut them down or drown their speech out, not even let it happen. So this idea of no platforming has become quite kind of common. And the problem is that the new normal has been established. The kind of threshold or the bar, the more these victories take place, the lower that becomes. So unfortunately, what we're trying to do is to reconcile the reality that some people don't need to be heard because they're just actually uninteresting or are saying something, we don't need to hear yet another racist expression or something like that, with this value of free speech. And I don't want to arbitrate that, and neither do you. So the mature response, of course, is to allow the speech that you don't like and have competing speech next door to counter it with other speech. But instead we're doing the shutting down thing. And as that's going to become more and more chilling. People are going to be afraid to say things. So many, I mean, Ace Makashule, the book about Ace Makashule, the Premier of the Free State, the Peter Louis Myburgh book. So the University of Free State recently also cancelled the launch of this book.
They're kidding me.
Yeah.
I didn't hear. Oh, really?
So the Cape Town launch was initially cancelled by exclusive and then moved from the book lounge to somewhere, I've forgotten where. And so it was moved to the book lounge from the waterfront, I think.
Yeah.
And then the irony is that the current Vice-Chancellor of the University of Free State was one of my Deputy Vice-Chancellors, the Flemming Rose thing. And they've recently cited security concerns for not letting Peter Louis Myburgh speak there, so in a sense the gambit is being repeated. But here, and there was no violence at the Cape Town launch, and no reason to fear violence at the UFS launch.
Yeah. It also, there was I remember, I wonder if this relates to, maybe from the other side of the political divide. You might help me remember the name of the particular chap. He's a vitriolic, gay-bashing American pastor who was invited by several conservative Christian congregations here in South Africa. You remember that?
Yes.
And there was a petition to shut down his invitation by eventually even petitioning the South African government to not grant him a visa.
And Australia did ban him.
And Australia banned him as well. And at the time there was a massive backlash from the religious right saying this amounts to the squashing of free speech, this person should be allowed. It's our religious freedom as well that's being impinged upon.
Stephen Anderson.
Stephen Anderson, that's the one. I feel that given what he has been on record as saying, the kind of inflammatory remarks he's made about gay and lesbian people, I felt it was justified for people to not want him to come to the country. But I wondered if it was going a step too far to ban the individual entirely. That maybe that kind of thing, but I'm not sure if I'm right on that. I wondered if it was justifiable. And I must admit, I feel like it was, but I don't have a good reason. I wouldn't want him to come to the country.
Yeah, sure.
And I certainly would want to make it hard for him to be speaking in a public forum in this country, given the far more sensitive situation gay and lesbian people live in this country. But refusing a visa seems, I don't know, is that too far?
See, here's the dilemma that your example poses, which I don't think that Home Affairs grappled with in that kind of case. I think that you are onto a good thing in saying that it could be understandable to not provide a visa because, on this principle, and I always like doing things by principle, not by case, right?
Yeah.
So in this case, the principle being violated is that a person X, is violating the constitution of the country she wants to visit. They're saying things that are in violation of our norms and values, whatever they are. Okay, so you're expressing this bigotry, and it is something which is potentially considered hate speech.
Yeah.
But the reason why he should have been granted a visa in this case is because we have not penalized or imprisoned Errol Naidu for doing the same thing.
Of course.
Right? So on the grounds of consistency, and for listeners who don't know, Errol Naidu is the leader of a religious movement based in Cape Town who repeatedly makes homophobic utterances. Many church people make homophobic utterances.
Right.
And none of them are disciplined or chastised. So if you're going to let them get a free pass,
Yeah.
you have to let Anderson in,
Yeah.
I think.
And by the same token, there are many like Anderson who might not be coming to this country for standing in a pulpit, but end up doing so.
Yes.
And they haven't expressed the intention to do so.
Yeah.
And because no one knows their intention, they're given a visa. So maybe, yeah.
And the concern with this line of thought we're talking about is that at the end of the road, you end up with kind of ideological purity tests.
Right.
So you can make the list even longer of what. So rather let them in,
Yes.
and then we, as I say, counter that speech and boycott them in a sense, all that sort of stuff. And you should, if you are in this religious example, if you're a religious person, you demand accountability from that church, and you say,
Right.
I'm going to stop supporting you,
Yep.
I'm going to stop coming to you, and I'm going to, as a religious person, I'm going to denounce you to kingdom come, you know, and encourage all people of faith to go to other churches because you've demonstrated that you are, you know, reprehensible. So we are, and then back to your point about personal responsibility, our reactions to these cases don't encourage that. They encourage avoiding the issue.
Right. Right.
And we become more and more infantilized.
Yeah. I wondered, some part of me wondered if the reaction of Home Affairs in the visa thing for Anderson might have been some sort of compensation for the scandal that was caused when the Dalai Lama was refused entry.
Yeah.
And I mean, that was not a free speech issue. Well, actually, it kind of was, wasn't it? I mean, basically, the government pressure was put on the South African government by the Chinese to refuse to give the Dalai Lama a platform to speak for Tibetan freedom in this country.
Yes.
So yeah, it's another classic instance of the government overstepping its
Mandate
principle and its mandate.
Although that case, of course, is more complicated by the fact that political pressure was brought to bear by China, and we, I mean, Dalai Lama doesn't have a terrible track record in terms of abusing China. I mean, he's quite restrained, actually. That's why the Tibetans are quite upset with him in many cases.
Right.
And they consider him a sellout.
Right.
So I don't think he would have done that. The point is that it's a loss of face, and also, perhaps even at that point, we knew that we might need China to buy Eskom or something like that. You know? So you don't want to piss them off.
Right.
And we can get to that topic in a future episode. The whole, I mean, state capture is not over, people.
Right.
It's being captured by others.
Yeah.
But so back to the thing we're talking about. I mean, on the question of the law and the disproportionate reactions to insiders like Errol Naidu and Anderson, the same sort of thing might be true about racist speech. And I see a lot of people complaining on Twitter that we ignore racist speech by black people and prosecute it vigorously by white people. And dear ex-Premier Zilla is going off on one of her Twitter benders at the moment about how nobody talks about black privilege, they only talk about white privilege.
So hashtag black privilege.
Yeah. So that's arguably in the same camp of inconsistencies. But again, these things aren't solved by slogans and Twitter mobs. They're far less influential than people might think. But the law, we've alluded to it before, let's get into it a bit more detail.
Yeah.
The law is weirdly inconsistent or unhelpful here. So we've got this Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act,
Yes.
PAPUDA. And PAPUDA is what the Equality Court relies on to make its judgments, as in the cases like the Shelley Garland case, which we'll outline in just a moment. But they're words that could be construed to demonstrate a clear intention to be hurtful, to be harmful, to incite harm, propagate or promote hatred. And Section 12 that are prohibited is very broad. It's race, gender, sex, marital status, colour, sexual orientation, etc. Even something as broad as undermines human dignity, which, like, what does that mean? And the Bill of Rights speaks about advocacy of hatred that also constitutes incitement. So a much stronger bar.
Right.
It's much more difficult to meet that threshold. So one of our laws allows
Why?
a broad interpretation.
Because it's actually inciting to a particular behaviour.
Well,
Violent behaviour.
it's not just advocacy.
Right.
It also is an incitement to cause harm. So I'm not
Yeah.
just saying
Yeah, yeah.
you are a worthless person. I'm saying you're a worthless person who doesn't deserve to live, or who doesn't deserve
And
housing.
I wish someone would kill you.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, there are nutters of all sorts who might be encouraged to follow if you were an influential thought leader or a religious cult leader or whatever it might be. Maybe there are a nutter or two out there who would do it. And so the application of Papuda has led us also, I think, down the path of this lowest common denominator approach towards hate speech.
Right.
Like the Shelley Garland case, do you recall?
Yeah, I remember.
The spoof column by, was it Maurice Root in the end, under the pen name Shelley Garland, which advocated that white people should be removed of their voting privileges. Voting privilege should be stripped from them.
Right.
So it was this kind of bleeding heart, kind of social justice warrior, equality argument thing. And the game was, you know, is this going to get published? Are people going to fall for it? Are they going to enthusiastically endorse it? Like, hey, here's how we do racial reconciliation. Like, for a few years, we disenfranchised. You've ruled the roost for so long.
Yeah, you can afford to let go for it.
Yeah. And then the editor has to resign because she's been roundly pilloried in the press. And, I mean, I think she did make mistakes.
Yeah.
But I think that that's the kind of thing which you read. Even if you believe that Shelley Garland is real, you read and say, meh, that's an opinion, stupid one.
Exactly.
And you leave it at that.
Yeah. There was certainly no incitement. I mean, and even if there was, in a very loose sense, how?
Yeah.
How would that be? To my mind, incitement is a form of words that encourages the population at large, not an organized body by any means, but potentially an individual or groups of individual, to cause harm. That article was essentially proposing something as a statutory norm to be implemented. On what good earth would that be possible?
Yeah.
It's just ridiculous to think that that would be insightful.
Yeah, but
inciting.
Yeah, but notice that, so that wasn't, it wasn't inciting, or insightful. So that the press ombudsman declared that as hate speech.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ridiculous.
Not one of these laws, but Penny Sparrow was declared hate speech for, forgotten, was it monkeys? What did she say?
Something apes, monkeys. I think it was monkeys.
Yeah. So she spoke about a lot of black South Africans or black tourists on a beach and referred to them as monkeys. Yeah. And that was convicted as hate speech by the Equality Court.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, so that's in a sense a more tricky one, because so that's reprehensible and hurtful language and so forth. It's certainly not inciting violence, so it shouldn't be a Bill of Rights issue.
No.
But is that the kind of thing that should be illegal?
Yeah.
Is for me not at all clear. I think it shouldn't be illegal.
I think it depends. If there was a clearer sense of the particular punishments that might be levied in cases like this, then it would be easier. But to my understanding is that it is not clear what punishments would be appropriate for the crime.
Yeah.
And so that's left up to the courts. And unfortunately, by the time, one of the things the courts seldom take into consideration is the recriminations that a person might suffer as a result of media exposure. And so, I mean, I can't remember what Sparrow's sentence was.
It was many hundreds of thousands of rands.
Yeah.
But of course, there were financial consequences beyond that.
Right,
Being hounded out of business and being threatened.
And surely she was punished way more than she deserved for a throwaway comment.
But more importantly, she was perhaps more violently punished than a Velaphi Khumalo, who it took a lot longer for that to work its way through the courts, but he eventually was also convicted of hate speech.
Yeah.
For what he did, and also by the Equality Court, and not any other. But his statement was calling for the country to be cleansed of white people.
Right, which is very inciting.
And that's far closer.
Much more dangerous.
Yeah. So we I think deal with these things disproportionately, and the people paying for a Penny Sparrow's blood all those consequences we mentioned a moment ago would say, oh, well, that's what she deserves, right? So there's this mob mentality that's encouraged. You're right about the lack of clarity with regard to sentence and the subjectivity of that. But also, when I said I wouldn't want these things to be illegal, going back to one of our earlier conversations on free speech, I understand why it's illegal, and right now I can understand it being illegal because of a temporary plaster we need to put on these things until they go away, or until we can cope with them in a more robust manner, or so, well, it's not so fresh, you know, the rules of apartheid and all that, and that might be fresh for far too long, and a situation of chilling speech becomes normalized, and we don't want that either.
Is it? One of the things I wondered about, is it possible for the courts to use the issue of hate speech as a way to start developing an intentional framework around a restorative justice rather than a punitive justice system? Because it seems to me that these are not crimes that require immediate recompense to a victim.
Yeah.
In the case of a murder or theft, there is a clear victim and somebody that needs substantial recompense, even if all that is a sense of vengeance, right? But in these cases, it's such a slippery, who is the victim, who's actually been hurt, and very often the punishment that is meted out ends up creating more hurt and more confusion, and does not aid the project of national reconciliation. And so the reason for the law having been created in the first place arguably must be national reconciliation, bringing us together, helping us understand the damaging effects of hate speech and the like. For me, then, it's a clear case that this act, the acts regulating free speech and hate speech, should be focused on restorative justice, and it wouldn't be difficult to implement. If someone, you can easily get to the point of convicting someone if what they say, you can have two categories, one that is about inciting to violence, but another category that is not inciting at all, but it's still hurtful, and you can implement restorative processes. So instead of a fine, the person must volunteer at an organization that works with children, or not children, so never children. Sorry, scratch that. But work with an organization that works with perhaps people living on the streets, or a feeding scheme, or something like that. Any form of exposure that gets the person out of their comfort zone, and they have to have that signed off from, you know.
Yeah, I mean, so that's what we do with many disciplinary offences at the university.
Right.
There's a certain number of community service hours, and in negotiation, in a sense, you can decide what's the best fit, where you're going to do most good, and as you're pointing out or alluding to, where you can perhaps also find the most personal value,
right,
and develop an understanding of your fellow South Africans. I mean, that's also concerned mine. I don't think that you're going to change the penny sparrow's mind by whacking her with a huge fine. She's going to just be resentful. And the second thing is that in a country which we know to have various corrupt systems, I also think that citizens should be mindful of the fact of where that money goes. And so if the money we knew was going to go into underprivileged schools or something like that, then we might be more supportive of a huge fine. But here it might just go into some dodgy slush fund.
It ends up reinforcing the ideologies of those who incline to hate speech. You know, the penny sparrow, for instance, is now seen as a martyr.
Yeah, or even for our alt-right leading friends, and not necessarily even a martyr, because they might also say, we don't like what she said, but we demand that she has the right to say it. A flag waver of the sacred cause, in a sense. But the problem is that the more the world gets kind of democratized and we have this kind of humanistic background understanding of equality and democracy and liberty and all that, it's more and more going to get distilled that only the most hateful things are the ones that get this kind of limelight. So your flag wavers of free speech are, I think, organically going to become more and more arsholic.
Right.
And you don't want these people to be examples
Right.
of that cause, yet they might be the only ones available
Right.
to you.
Yeah.
But I mean, on the court thing, that kind of system of community service punishments or something like that, I mean, of course it's going to be difficult to find a good scale of punishment, appropriate ones. We're really just saying or you're really just saying that the framework for thinking about it must go away from retributive
Yeah.
towards something that is restorative.
Yeah. And it doesn't even need to be a community service. I'm not a big fan of community service,
Okay.
honestly, because I think if you take someone who is not inclined to offer themselves in service, they're not going to be able to contribute. But you can create programs in the same way that we create diversion programs for people who commit minor offenses. And those diversion programs are designed to steer them away from becoming institutionalized within a criminal justice system. So you want to create programs like life skills programs for students who are regularly being picked up for drunken disorderly behavior. So instead of sending them to a community service agency, they go and attend a project maybe run by a youth organization that provides life skills to young people in terms of, well, what does it mean to be a mature adult? What does it take? What are the life skills you need to know? And it's amazingly beneficial that these diversion programs work for minor crimes and at-risk youth. They can just as easily be adapted for individuals who have run afoul of our values around what we deem hateful in public discourse.
Right.
And they may even be saleable as opportunities for people at institutions that are, for instance, not just crimes that are brought to equality court, but in a company where there may be a mediation call because one staff member has been going off at another staff member and it's descended into a racist row. That kind of thing is classically able to be held and facilitated by programs like this, and is being done anyway. So it seems to me that it would be far more valuable for the courts to direct their attentions towards that kind of more constructive way of dealing with the offense, because it implicitly regards the offender as redeemable.
Right.
And what's the point of free speech or prescriptions against hurtful speech if we don't also fundamentally value the redeemability of other people?
Yeah.
We have free speech because I believe I can convince others of my good ideas. Therefore, any affront to that free speech, or any attack against it, or any misuse of it, has to be treated and as a social failure, not a criminal failure. It is regarding this human being could be better. And so I will use this free speech opportunity to redeem them. Yeah.
At some point, I think we would want to give up on a person. But I think that beautiful set of suggestions you made there implies that we give up too soon and that our systems are premised on a giving up rather than on any chance of finding the value. And I think that's a fantastic place to leave this series for now. And we are really, as a concluding message, are saying that we must be careful of giving up on our humanity and on our relations by deferring all of these difficult questions to things like institutions and laws, and rather think about what their purpose is, as you say, redistributive sort of justice and creating ways to make conversations and creating ways in which we can help ourselves and each other become better people.
Absolutely.